Do you mind
very
going?
positive show.
Do you mind going to the page and checking it out?
Yeah, I was just on the YouTube channel wondering why you weren't live.
Yeah. Hey folks, welcome. Sorry, just a few technical difficulties, so working through that. If you want to ask a question, go ahead, sign in to your YouTube channel and go ahead, type a question or type checking in. I'll know the feed is up if you would, please. We'll get started in just a few minutes.
Yep.
Yep, as far as it worked and you heard me and we're good?
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah, okay. Okay, thanks so much.
Yeah.
I'm good, I don't need to. Unless you said something on. Thanks so much. Bye. Yes. Yep, we should do. We're live, just so you know. You remember that? What's the story behind it, Joey?
This was the only one that did leave.
That is correct. I think it was. I think we only got the one tray, but that one tray was like $65 or something. So it's a $65 sedum.
You can still see leaves. I think.
Oh yeah,
Things are nice with it.
that's the interesting thing, right? Because it's somewhat bulletproof.
Why do you see them expensive?
I'm not sure.
This year is still 10, right?
Yes, sir. Yep. Well, folks, 9:30. We'll go ahead and get started. So, raised bed gardening. Thank you very much for tuning in. Hope to about half an hour kind of answer some questions. If you'd like to sign in to your YouTube account, please feel free to type away on the questions, and then spend some time kind of going over raised bed gardening. Being that it's very popular, you get to set up the bed itself very quickly. It's the investment on the start end. If you caught the description, for the class, what we're really wanting to focus on is more so getting out of that bed the money that you've put into it and more. So seeing how you can kind of plant for an easy way of going about it, but then also too maximizing that space and what you have in there to actually use in the kitchen. For the most part, herb plants, which is what we focus on, are pretty utilitarian. They grow, you eat them, they grow back, you eat them, and that's kind of the arrangement. So with that in mind, there's a few things we'll go over how to get the most out of the plants themselves. But as far as the bed itself, it really is premium planting real estate is what you've paid for. So you can make the bed out of whatever you want. You fill it with the dirt and the soil. We'll get to that in just a minute. But as far as the bed itself, it can be somewhat inexpensive. It can be very expensive, just like most everything else. So we've got one here that I'll show you that you put together very easily. This is kind of on the expensive side because you can put it right near your house. So right near your door, right near your back door, front door. It's cedar. It looks quite attractive. It's a nice kind of 4-foot width, 2-foot deep, and then kind of, I think it's about 9 inches of soil depth too. So it's a nice size to grow, not just kind of just herbs. You can do some vegetables in it. The vegetables are somewhat limited. You don't want anything getting too big. But again, that goes back to the premise of getting the most out of the bed. You could grow a cabbage in there. It'll take up half of that bed, and you will have saved about $1.50 buying a cabbage at the store. Or you can fill it with lettuces, kale, chard, or cilantro, basil, dill, thyme, rosemary, and hopefully save yourself quite a bit more than just that $1.50 from the cabbage. So again, your bed, you do with it how you want to, but when you're going to spend the kind of money that a raised bed will have you end up spending, it's a good idea to kind of think about the dollars and cents. Easy example of that would be a rosemary. So a rosemary plant starts out nice and small. Get this little 4-inch pot here, take that home. By about July, it's going to be about 4 times the size. At that point, if you're just growing it for use in your house, that's really more than enough rosemary for you to use in the house. The thing of it is, though, it will just continue to grow and grow and grow and grow. So this one is a nicer one to have planted in the ground, a separate container out of the way, because again, it gets big quick and you don't use all that much of it because it's, again, very strong. So you can dry it, obviously, make hay while the sun shines. So grow it through the season, dry it for the use in the winter kind of thing. That's a really nice way of going about it too. But as far as a rosemary in a raised bed, unless you prune it weekly, it really is going to get quite large, and then it's taking up too much space more than likely. So what do I mean by the layout? Let's kind of look at this one real quick. So we've got that laid out for you with the bed. And to give you an idea, they're spaced fairly close together. If you're going to space them that close, they need to be cut on fairly regularly. The nice thing with that close, though, is that it allows you to maximize your plant area. In that bed that is 4 foot long by 2 foot wide, you can get anywhere from about 15 to 20 herbs in there. You're going to sacrifice some space if you're going to do vegetables, but just kind of before we get started and get into the what you make the bed and fill it with and all the rest of it, the ongoing care, kind of start to think about what plants you use already, as far as if you use oregano, if you use basil, if you use parsley. And then we have all of the weird and wonderful lemon verbena, lemongrass, lemon thyme. Then we have Thai basil, a whole hot and spicy oregano. So you can fill a bed very quickly with the herbs with the idea of, I'm going to use that, I'm going to use that. What might be easier is, what do I already use? And then what can I add on and try and experiment with a few things and see how they work out. So the area itself, as you look at kind of how much of an area, you can look at ones that are elevated off the ground. You can also obviously look at raised beds that are on the ground. The ones that are on the ground are going to be a little cheaper square foot wise, in the sense of you will get more bed and more planting space. When you buy an elevated raised bed that's up off the ground, that's actually what you're paying for. No bending over, no weeding. It allows you to put it nice and close to wherever you're going to use it, hopefully, as long as it gets good sun. And then with that in mind, the more convenient it is, the more you'll be using it. And then the more you use it, the more you want to invest more into it and get more out of it, kind of thing. It's a nice cycle to get into, instead of just having it done, getting it overgrown, getting full of bugs, and really not yielding too much to help you out. So on the raised bed side, on the ground, raised up, the soil is about the same. It's a third compost, a third topsoil, and a third sand. There are other systems. Square foot gardening would be probably an easy example to reference. So square foot gardening is a recipe of vermiculite, perlite, other compost, different types of compost and different types of soil in there. And I don't think one is better than the other. It's just two different ways of going about it. The soil that we have for this bed is the raised bed mix and the mushroom compost. So raised bed mix is this one. Mushroom compost is this one. Sorry, folks, doing the best I can. The raised bed mix that's in the bag actually has sand in it, so it's a nice blend that's a little fluffier than heavy soil. The mushroom compost is your trace minerals elements. It kind of goes on the top as a top dress. As far as dirt for in the ground, for a raised bed that's in the ground, we have 8x4, so 8 foot by 4 foot beds here that are a foot deep. And that's quite a bit of soil. If you're going to have to pay for it in the bag, you're going to pay for the convenience of a bag, and it's going to cost you quite a bit. To fill an 8 foot by 4 foot bed, 12 inches deep, it's probably going to run you anywhere from $200 to $300 worth of soil in a bag. You can get bulk loads, the compost, the topsoil, and the sand, and then mix it all together, and it's a lot cheaper. For the bed that we have here, that you can see, so this one is elevated off the ground. And again, to show you kind of off the ground there. So that one is 4 foot wide, 2 foot or 4 foot long, 2 foot wide and 9 inches deep. So it takes 3 of those raised bed garden mixed soil bags of soil and 1 of the mushrooms. So that's right at about $50 worth of dirt for that bed. With that in mind, you're obviously set up quick, ready, easy, and off and running very quickly. On the one in the ground, it would be a good idea to lay down some. It's called chicken wire. It's also called rat wire, but it's a 1/4 inch square or 1/2 inch square galvanized wire that's on a roll, and you lay that out. You put the bed on top of it, and that will ensure no moles and voles are going to mess with you too much. So. Nice to do that at the start rather than find out at the end and have to dig your dirt out, put that in there after you've got a problem. So either way you go about it, again, on the bed itself, the soil is compost, and that is not manure. Manure, chicken manure, cow manure, horse manure, that's a fertilizer. Compost is a soil amendment. So it's just to keep the soil light and fluffy and give the plants the trace minerals and elements that they need. Your topsoil is really just your fill, and then your sand, which is kind of the odd one to hear about. The sand is going to provide your drainage. It's the same of a potting soil versus a potting mix. A potting soil stays wet and heavy and stays wet for a long time, and the plants will grow, but they won't grow as quickly when that cycling of drying out happens. So the quicker they go from wet to dry and they cycle through that, the quicker it goes from wet to dry. Once you water it again, it goes back to being dry. The quicker that happens, the healthier those plants are going to be. So a raised bed garden in the ground, all raised up with the sand added into that soil, that's actually what's going to help give you that drainage and keep your soil light and fluffy and allow the plants to grow quickly. So the sand, though, is not any type of sand. The sand is coarse grain. So a nice big coarse grain of sand, not gravel, sand, and it's not your play sand, it's not your beach sand, your paver sand. It's very fine. It's got that yellowy kind of orange look to it normally. That is a nice big coarse grain, and again, that's actually what keeps that soil light and fluffy. If you use the play sand or the paver sand, that really fine stuff, the beach sand, it's going to compact. And again, your roots aren't going to develop as quickly as they should. So that's kind of your soil mix, topsoil, compost, and sand. For in the bag, a bagged mix for an elevated raised bed, you still kind of want that consistency of a soil. You can set it up as a potting mix only, like a giant container on legs. That potting mix soil isn't really the best solution for the plants year after year after year after year. It really relies on you adding into it fertilizers, even for the herb plants. Whereas on a soil blend with your topsoil, compost, and sand, you're really not going to have to feed your herb plants in that bed. There's going to be enough from the rain and the activity of the soil with the mushroom compost that you'll add once a year kind of thing to top it up with. That's really going to be all you need for that, for the herb plants. So, what to make it out of. We don't get into the what to make it out of. This is cedar. Raised beds on the ground are a cedar. Everyone's going to have their own way of going about it. I've seen cinder blocks. I've seen old windows. I've seen tree logs. I've seen just regular old wood from the hardware store. So again, you make it out of whatever you want, but bear in mind as you're doing that, the bed itself is you're creating real estate for you to plant in. So you want to be maximizing your return on investment from that. So what are some plants that can go in there? Herbs are an easy one. The nice thing with herbs is the roots and the top growth grow in tandem. So roots, top growth, top growth. If you're always cutting on the top growth, it's not putting out more roots. It's always putting out more fresh top growth. The nice thing with that is how we laid it out in that bed, quite nice and tight. It really maximizes that space. So instead of it getting huge and growing you a really big plant, you're having a lot of little plants and you're cutting on them very, very regularly. And I mean, at least once a week, you're cutting on stuff to make sure that it's, again, focusing on putting out more fresh top growth as opposed to growing more roots to offer you more top growth that you really don't need, because on that smaller plant, you're still going to have enough production for that week to get through. And then by the time you come back through, it will have regrown and got on, and again, yielded you more. So with that in mind, you can plant things in there that you wouldn't ordinarily put all together. A nice thing to do is kind of keep your leafy stuff together. So basil, parsley, dill, those kind of things that are leafy, high water content, chew through the water very quickly. Those ones are nice kept together, because as you water, you're going to be watering kind of that area usually all at the same time. Whereas oregano, a rosemary, thyme, those are going to need less water. So those you're going to water less often, and nice to keep them together to let them dry out. So with that in mind, kind of keeping them at separate ends or grouping them kind of together is a nice way to go about it. It just makes it a little easier on you for watering. So vegetables. So what vegetables can you put in a raised bed? Well, if it's on the ground and it's 12 inches deep, you can plant most anything you want to. A good way to think about it is a tomato is at the very least going to take up an 18 by 18 kind of inch square. If you have the luxury of space, even a 20 to 22 inch kind of square, those tomatoes get very large. And really the basic premise for all of your plants in a raised bed in a smaller area there, you do not want foliage kind of intertwining. And what I mean by that is where your plants are growing and you keep them cut, there's still this alleyway for the air, and that's what keeps the bugs down, makes it a little easier on you. When you've got foliage from plants that are kind of a little overgrown and it's big, it's stopping that airflow. And that's what the bugs love. They love kind of stagnant. They love a canopy to keep the humidity in there so they're nice and moist. And then obviously natural predators have a harder time finding them. So when you're planting, kind of look at what you've got going on, because a raised bed that's elevated off the ground, they're usually smaller. You really don't want to be putting a full-size tomato in those. A full-size tomato is about a 5-gallon bucket's worth of dirt. So if it's not as deep as that bucket and your raised bed is shallower, which most of those elevated beds are, it's going to spread out, which will take up more surface area, which allows you to grow less plants. Again, if tomatoes is what you want and you have the space to do it and you want to do that, by all means, it's your bed. It's going to take up more of a 2 foot by 2 foot square. So in that bed we showed you, it's going to take up half of that bed. That is only one season. You'll come back through in late September and put in there some spinach and some kale. So again, on the size of the plant, just be mindful that that real estate is what you're taking up with that plant. Is that plant worth that much to me that it can take up that amount of real estate? So tomatoes that work a little better in those elevated beds that are not as deep as that 12 inches would be a cherry tomato. You can usually get away with doing one of those. You'll get a little less production than you would in the ground. But when that tip grows up and it's tall enough that you can reach right up, let me rephrase that. When you plant it, as it grows, once it's starting to get too tall, you can actually take that tip and snap that tip of that tomato, and it will make that tomato stop growing up and then start to grow out. So again, it's going to not be that 10 foot in the air kind of thing, and then you're going to have to support it. So those cocktail tomatoes, we've had the patio tomato, which is a thicker stem, and it's a bushier plant. It gives you a medium-sized slicing tomato that's not a big full size like a beefsteak, but it isn't a cherry. So it's kind of that middle ground. The patio tomato or a cocktail tomato is usually a nice idea for in there. Again, but it does take up quite a bit of space. Chilies, peppers, eggplant. I've seen folks do cucumbers at the back, kind of create a trellis on the back of that bed, and you can plant all those as well. Do bear in mind your summer vegetables, so any of your vines, your cucumbers, your tomatoes, those kind of ones do take up quite a good amount of soil space to actually feed that plant to grow it. So you're looking at least an 18, well, anywhere from a 12 by 12 kind of square foot to an 18 by 18, and a little more if you can with tomatoes all kind of planted together, because again, they do get quite large. So you're not trying to keep the tomato wholly separate from one another. Little leaves and outer extremities kind of touching and brushing is usually not a big deal. You just don't want main branches of your tomato plant kind of crossing one to another, because again, that just cuts down too much of the airflow. And obviously a cucumber is vertical. So if you trellis that, you can kind of tuck it towards the back or aside and kind of get away with, again, having it draw from the soil underneath instead of kind of having it stepped out into your bed and taking up, the dirt and all behind it as well. So vegetables are fine in raised beds. They work quite nicely. Raised beds in general are just a nice way to garden quickly with fairly good results. I mean, the third blend, so third topsoil, compost, and sand. And then you'd add in for your vegetables like a fertilizer. This has got mycorrhizae fungi in it as well, which is helpful for your roots. Tomato tone for tomato has calcium in there as well. So any of your vegetables, you're going to want to fertilize. Any of the herbs, you really shouldn't have to. Your parsley plant is your canary of the garden. So if your parsley, nice and green and lush, no feeding required for any of the other herbs that you have in that area. Parsley's yellow, and I'm not talking just those kind of older, smaller leaves, but predominantly yellow. As long as you're not overwatering it, it's a sign that you're lacking the nutrients, the nitrogen, and so forth. So you can go ahead and feed it just a really small dose of something. But again, on your parsley, that's really your indicator for your other for your other plants there on the herb side only. So herbs really don't like a whole lot of food, if any. The nice thing with setting it up with more of a soil, that compost, sand, and topsoil mix, is you really don't have to feed your herb plants. But again, the parsley is going to help you out, figure if you need to or not. And then vegetables, obviously you would, because they get so large. They have to grow all that foliage. They have to grow all those roots as well. They have to put out the blooms, and then they have to make the fruit. So they do chew through and need a little bit of food as well. The raised beds kind of on the ground. Again, that area, we often get asked about squirrels, raccoons, problems, moles, voles, rabbits even. So if you have a problem and you know it, go ahead and set it up as easily as you can to take care of the problem. What I mean by that is the bed itself. If you know you've got squirrels, then just build a little fence around it. You can even build a little cage kind of thing over top of it. Nice little door on one side. That's what steers some people towards that elevated bed, because again, you can put it closer where they're not going to mess with you as much. And then obviously you're out there, looking at it and enjoying it as well. The other thing on the sunlight, so full sun, they love to bake. Being outside in the full sun for an herb plant, a vegetable plant, that's really what they want. They need all of that sunlight to grow. So if you don't have very much sunlight, just try to find the area that you have the most and put your bed there. Less sun equals less growth. So if you're trying to grow a cabbage in 4 to 6 hours of sunlight, that's really going to struggle. You're better off trying lettuces, kale, and chard, and of your leafier greens that'll again produce quickly for you and will continue to produce and cycle through as you cut them, enjoy them, they'll regrow, and you'll cut them again. Whereas a cabbage, it's a nice thing to have kind of thing, but really in that limited sunlight, it's going to take a lot longer for it to grow. And usually we're heating up in springtime as we give way to summer, so it's not going to last. So again, kind of think of full sun, how much sun do I get as to how productive that bed's going to be for you. Some things not to plant in your raised bed. So larger vegetable plants, squashes, pumpkins, watermelons, kind of thing in the elevated beds I'm talking out more so here. So those ones, because they get so large, and those vegetables, they're somewhat cheap from the store, from the farmer's market, you've got to kind of balance that. Again, that dollars and cents kind of look to it. So again, you do with it what you want in the sense of, what you put in there. Maybe, folks will get the watermelons to show the grandkids and they really enjoy it. So whatever suits what you've got going on. But those vegetables that get very, very large are obviously going to take some of the nutrients, but then those leaves are going to shade off some other things for you as well. The other one would be mint. So if anyone's planted mint in the ground, you know that the easiest way to get rid of mint is to go ahead and move house. You let the mint stay with those who have bought your house, and at the next house, put mint in a container and keep it containerized. If you plant mint in a nice raised bed, you're obviously going to have a whole raised bed full of mint, which is not a bad idea, but it's an expensive mint plant. I have a question. How often should you feed the veggies? Is there a litmus test for those? What we've found to do is you take that recommended feeding for it and split it into 2 applications. So on a bag of like chicken poop or something, it's going to tell you, let's say 5 pounds per 100 square feet. So you've got a bed that's, let's say it's 8 by 4, like the beds that we have here, so 32 square feet. So it's about 1/3 of 100 there. So we've got about 1.5 pounds, pound and 1.6 kind of a pound. That will take, and we'll take that measurement and we'll split it into 2 applications. So we'll plant it, we'll fertilize and use half of that application at the beginning to feed the plant to begin with. We'll come back through kind of halfway through the growing cycle and add that extra fertilizer back in there and continue to feed that plant. So we just found when you feed it at the beginning, it works quite well too. And then we found, splitting it into the 2, it works just as well. And kind of from the reasoning of keeping it fed through the season kind of thing, instead of just putting it all in there at the beginning and then kind of having the plant, again, maybe lack it towards the end. That's kind of what we've found. We'll rough it into the soil too as your plant is growing. Obviously, you don't want to be disturbing the dirt around it too much, but we'll just take the hand and kind of rough it into the dirt, feed around that canopy that second time. So it's a little more problematic on things like your lettuce, things like your spinach, where you've got to get kind of in and under the foliage. So again, as far as a litmus test for it, it would be very slow production, yellowing of the leaves is kind of more so a lack of nutrients. Again, as long as you're not overwatering. If the plant sits in water, sometimes it can yellow just because it's not growing as quickly as it should be, and it's kind of stressing and dying. So be mindful, as long as you're not overwatering, letting things dry out. Now, when you water, though, water very thoroughly and well, and then let it dry back out again. On the litmus test for the vegetables, though, it's really just more so you can have diseases and blights, but the slower growth and lack usually offers you the evidence as a lack of nutrients. But then also watering too. Took us a while to figure out on the cabbage and the broccoli, how to grow those well in spring. They like to dry out, but not to the point of like a tomato or a pepper where it can dry to the point of wilting. The tomato and the pepper, you let it dry to the point of kind of wilting because those plants, need to put out a lot of root base. So with that, you want it to make sure it's thinking, well, it's not going to get watered now, so it's going to search out for the more water. A cabbage and a broccoli, you still want that drying in between the 2, but it doesn't wilt first. It will actually slow down and stop growing, and then a day or two later, that's when it wilts. So you've lost a few days in that process. So those you keep you keep moist, but not wet. So you water it, let it dry out just to the drier side of moist. You'll water it again, and then obviously it's a heavier feeder because it's got a shorter season. So next question, do you need to replace all the soil each year or just add new soil mixed to the existing bed? So raised bed on the ground, elevated raised bed, both of those, you wouldn't have to replace your dirt each year. You would just top dress with some mushroom compost. So an 8x4 bed, it'll settle an inch or two over the season from one year to the next. We'll go ahead and put 2 or 3 bags of mushroom compost on that bed to fill it up and just kind of top dress it. On the elevated bed, that's the 4x2, it really only takes 1 bag of mushroom. You're only looking to kind of top dress the top ½ inch to an inch kind of thing. So the soil, the topsoil compost sand, that's really more of a perennial garden mix dirt that's very, very long term. It's a perennial. You don't need to switch it out year after year. If you set it up with just straight up potting mix, I'm really not sure. We've not done that before. I know you're going to get quite a few years out of it as far as never having to replace it. I'm really not sure on that. Another question I missed. What do you put on the bottom of the raised bed? So Kathy, I'm going to answer that question to open it up to what I didn't talk about before, because all I talked about was that wire kind of underneath to keep the moles and voles out. So if you've got a bare area and you're looking to put a raised bed in for the first time, maybe you're even looking to add a bed, the grass on top needs to be dealt with. You need to get rid of it, whether you kind of shovel off the top inch or two of grass and most of the roots and get rid of it that way. Spray it and kill it. A lot of folks will use cardboard and put that down, because if you're going to put a raised bed on grass, you're going to end up with a really nice raised bed full of grass if you don't deal with it to begin with. So you want to do something, and something's better than nothing. So scraping it off is obviously the most work because you're having to shovel all of it off and put it somewhere. The nice thing with that is it gets most of the problem out of the way, and then some cardboard over top of that will probably take care of the grass will not bother you again. Cardboard will break down into the soil. It's very nice like that, so it's a good layer to have. It's just that if you only put 1 or 2 layers of it, it's not going to kill off all of the grass underneath it, so you'll still have some. If you do 3 and 4 and 5 layers, then you're eating into your soil a little bit. So again, cardboard only might not be the way to go if you want to take care of it from the beginning. The one thing I would advise not to do is weed fabric, the black kind of weed fabric. I know it's woven, it'll allow water through. It just doesn't allow the roots really down into your soil, which is kind of an advantage if you're only going 6 or 8 inches deep instead of the full kind of 12 inches deep. 12 inches deep, vegetables, herbs, everything will grow in that. You're not going to do carrots really, root vegetables, because they need even more, 18 to 24 inches. But that's a lot of expense to grow those few other things. So it's about a 12 inches, the standard size on the depth. So weed fabric on the bottom doesn't allow most of those roots to go through. It holds in the water a little bit, and it just doesn't allow the bed to drain as quickly as it ordinarily would. So the soil blend kind of mixed all in together. Don't layer those topsoil, compost, and sand. Mix all of that in together, nice uniform from top to bottom. But again, that weed fabric would you probably avoid, because again, it's not going to serve long term. Excellent solution for the immediate future of that grass. It's not going to allow most of that through. But again, kind of that next year, year after, it starts to work against you, unfortunately. One thing real quick on this bed. So the bed itself has the liner. Fabric liner there to hold it in. Goes together very easily. It's no tools, and it just slides down in together. And then you're off and running. So no tool, sets up in 10 minutes. there's other ones that are on the ground now that you can get that kind of just hook into corners and are very easy to put together. That's really why the raised beds work so nicely. So containers are kind of expensive. You've got to buy the container, buy the soil, and you're off with a few plants. You put all that money together instead of having a few containers, and you get a raised bed itself, and that's going to offer you probably a little more planting real estate than separate containers do for the same kind of money. And then obviously on the ground, if it is, you get kind of more for your money on that side. So the raised beds on the ground, more of a kind of a full scale production with your all of your vegetables, your herbs. We've got asparagus now that's ready, rhubarb. So those kind of things would work quite nicely in there as well. Whereas in a raised bed that's elevated, that's more so all of your herbs and your leafy kind of stuff, your lettuce, kale, and spinach and chard, and then some vegetables, if that's what you're limited to on the side of having to plant them in that as opposed to being able to put them in the ground. Give it just a few more minutes, folks, in case you have any other questions. Again, to recap, so raised beds work on planting real estate. That's what you want to be getting out of those beds kind of the most and the quickest. You can plant things a little closer together, but you don't want them to be overgrown. Full sun is going to help you out tremendously. It really is the best way to grow them because, again, when you go out at 5 o'clock on a July afternoon, they're not going to look happy, but nothing really in the garden does. They will use that sunlight, though, to grow you all of that healthy produce and really kind of accelerate that as the spring gives way to the summer. And then don't forget a raised bed really should allow you to see garden 3 seasons. So spring crops, summer crops, fall crops, and they'll probably go through the winter a little bit too. So let me finish up with that point. So 3-season gardening. Again, you've paid for that real estate. How do I get as much out of it as possible? Tomatoes, peppers, herb plants, usually the starting point. Hopefully that branches into lettuce and kale and chard and different things in the spring and the fall. Again, you've got it sitting there. Think of it like a factory. You've got the factory sitting there, and it should be producing for you. So with that in mind, early to mid-March is your spinach, your kale, your chard. So that goes in there. As March gives way to April, that's when your salad, your lettuce, your arugula, mustard greens, things like that can go in there. And then you'll have those and they'll be productive all the way through probably Mother's Day, if not a few days after. The nice thing with that is tomatoes and peppers, all of your summer vegetables are called summer vegetables because it's just that. They grow through the summertime. So you're not going to take out a lettuce in late April that's growing very, very quickly and giving you a lot of fresh lettuce for the house when you really want to plant tomatoes, but it's still too early. Tomatoes and peppers and all go in kind of that Mother's Day time frame. It's not just about the air temperature being warm, it's your soil temperature as well. So really around Mother's Day is when the soil starts to really warm up to be able to receive those vegetables and again have them grow very quickly. Instead of them sitting in cold soil and growing very, very slow kind of thing at the beginning. And then those tomatoes and peppers and all will produce all the way through September. September gives way to October. They'll start to slow down. That would be the time to take those out, put back in your kale, your spinach, your chard. So kale and spinach and chard, those ones will grow through Thanksgiving. They'll perk back up in the spring of next year, and you'll be able to start harvesting from them again. If you put lettuce in there, the lettuce will have most of October into early November. But when we start to freeze every night, the lettuce will die out. So it's a nice one to have because it grows so quickly and gives you a really good yield per plant. But those other hardier greens, your kale, your spinach, your chard, those ones are a bit better value because they'll last longer into the fall and they'll come out of winter into spring the next year quite easy too. So question was battling wisteria. Would the wire and cardboard keep that out, or would the mat be better in that situation? That's a hard one. I'm from Australia. We do have wisteria, but not like it's over here kind of thing. So I know that is fairly invasive, hard to get rid of. You've got a choice to make, right? So your weed fabric is going to be by far the better choice to keep the wisteria out of that bed. It's going to have your plants grow a little slower than if it wasn't there because of drainage. The cardboard would certainly keep it out until that cardboard composted into the dirt, and then kind of anyone's guess at that point. That wire underneath to keep the moles and voles out is kind of big, so those runners is probably going to come up through the runners. So sorry that I couldn't give you a definitive answer on that, but that's a hard one because the wisteria obviously grows so easily. Probably the thing I would do is before I put that bed in, I'd take a pickaxe and kind of dig up wherever I could find the majority of it. And again, that will buy you a good amount of time later on and hopefully be able to take care of the problem for the most part. The other thing to do would be to kind of have an area around your bed that is clear of grass and so forth and anything growing. And then you can take care of it from coming up kind of up and under around your bed, kind of like a moat to a castle. So kind of keep that area that you can dig in and mess around in more so than digging down into your bed. So I think that just about answers everything, folks. I'll give it another minute for questions and all. And then one other thing I really wanted to talk, and I didn't really have the point come up quick enough. So cilantro and dill. This is ones we get questions on all the time. Why can't I grow cilantro? And it's actually not anything about the plant that can't be grown. More so, it's a pretty easy. I mean, if you're growing basil, if you're growing oregano, this is really no different of a plant. It's a different growing season. Dill and cilantro are cool weather annuals. They like the cool times of year, kind of like me. I like the spring and the fall and not so much the summer. So with that, you plant it late March, early April. You'll have it through about Mother's Day or third week of May. It will go to seed and flower at that point as it really starts to warm up pretty consistently. And then you plant it again early September and have it through kind of early November. We do have a cilantro substitute. It's called Vietnamese coriander. It's not the exact same flavor, but very, very close. And that will actually grow spring, summer, and fall. On the dill plant, no substitute for that. So just grow the dill in the spring and the fall, harvest it, and then either freeze it for your dishes later. So really appreciate you tuning in, folks. We're going to finish it up with that. We are in the process of putting together other classes. So container gardening, we'll do one later as April gives way to May on citrus, on berries, on the other things that we have. We'll probably end up doing one soon with the asparagus and the rhubarb and the horseradish, which are new varieties for us. We'll have some pollinator classes as well with the milkweed and the different flowers that we have for pollinators and for hummingbird nectar plants and so forth. So stay tuned. Hope to see you soon and enjoy gardening.